Our scripture reading is John 19, verse 14, and it's right in your bulletin. If you'd like to follow with me, John 19, verse 14. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king."
Sabbath. Is everyone awake?
Yes.
How's everyone doing this morning? I want to talk a little bit this morning to begin with about our human justice system. We have actually two parts to the justice system. You have criminal justice and you have civil law or civil justice. The way it usually works is that there's a representative of the state whose job it is to investigate crimes and to determine who's the perpetrator of those crimes. And then once the state, through their representatives, determines who has perpetrated those crimes, then they bring them to court or litigation, and in that courtroom, then the evidence is brought forward to determine whether they're guilty or innocent. And there's something else going on. We don't know, we don't hear about this, and it's not really part of the process, but nevertheless, it does happen because when the state has determined that someone is guilty and they bring them to court, part of that hearing, part of the jury's decision, either agrees with the state or disagrees with the state in determining whether that person is the guilty person or not. And then, of course, at the end of the process, you have a jury of peers, usually 12 people. At the end of that process, the determination is made whether the defendant is guilty or innocent, and then if he's guilty, then you have the sentencing. And after that, after the courtroom proceedings, you have the execution of the sentence. So why did I bring that up?
Why? Judgment.
The judgment, yes. This is a quotation from Ben Whishaw. I don't know who he is. Ben Whishaw says, "The criminal justice system, like any system designed by human beings, clearly has its flaws." That's probably true. It's a human, our justice system is human-made and human-run. Then Megan Shepherd, again, I don't know who she is, but she said, "The last thing the justice system is just."
Amen.
Somebody said amen. Okay. So, what about God and his justice system? It's just, all right. We're going to talk a little bit today, and that's what we're going to talk about, is God's justice system, which includes the judgment. This is from Christopher Darden. "The law has no compassion, and justice is administered without compassion." Now, that's probably true of the human justice system. But is that statement true about God's administering of justice? I think when we look through things today, that we'll discover that God's administration of justice is done through his compassion. All right? This is from William E. Gladstone. "Justice delayed is justice denied." What do you think about that statement? Is that statement true?
No.
God's justice, is it delayed? It's been delayed for a long time, really, the final account. really, and his justice has been delayed now for a long, long time, hasn't it? But does that mean that God is going to deny his created beings of justice?
Not at all.
Not at all. In fact, God has good reason for delaying his justice. So that's not correct either. So let's talk about God's justice system, for lack of a better word. Really what we're talking about is the judgment. And just like the justice system that we have here on earth through human beings, there are also three phases or three parts to God's justice system and the way it works. There is the investigative judgment. This we call a pre-advent judgment because it actually happens before the second advent, before his second coming. This judgment, when did it start? In 1844. And my purpose this morning is not to show when that started and all of this that we have already believed as Seventh-day Adventists. If anyone wants to know that, then we could certainly have Bible studies or something like that going on. But in 1844, the investigative judgment began. Well, what's taking place during this investigative judgment?
Those who claim to be righteous starts with the house of God, right?
Okay.
So it's a pre.
That
there's
is-
other things.
He moved from the holy to most holy place.
He moved from the holy to the most holy place, and he's going through the cases, going through the lives of each individual, every individual on earth, past and present.
Yeah.
Right? Every case is brought before God's throne and determined whether they will receive the justice that God is going to mete out in the end or not. We're going to talk more about this. So every case will be decided. Oh dear.
The salvation or not is what we'll
Yes, whether they'll have salvation or not. Every case will be decided, and that's what's going on now. Is this taking place on earth or up in heaven?
in heaven.
In the heavenly sanctuary in heaven. That's taking place right now. This is the phase of the judgment that really concerns us now because we're living through it. We're living in that phase of the judgment. The second phase of the judgment is the post-advent or millennial phase of the judgment. This takes place during the 1,000 years after the second advent. Not here on earth. It's in heaven after the second advent. And during this phase of the judgment, what's taking place?
We are looking at the books.
We are looking at the books. We meaning who?
Those people who are delivered by God.
Yes, the righteous. Those who have been determined to have eternal life. Those who will have their names in the book of life. They are going to look through the records and every question will be answered. And we're going to talk more about this. This is just kind of preliminary. The last phase of the judgment, or the third phase of the judgment, is the execution of the sentence. Isn't that right? The execution part of the judgment. And what takes place at that time? Just what I said, the execution. It's a little more complicated than just coming to, oh, let's have the execution of the judgment. There's a little more going on than that. Again, we're going to talk about that. But we're going to talk about all of this, these three phases of the judgment we're going to talk about in reference to the passion of Jesus Christ. All right? The passion of Christ.
And explain passion.
All right, the passion of Jesus, meaning really Gethsemane, the judgment hall of Pilate and Caiaphas and Herod, the judgment halls that he went through. So, Gethsemane, the judgment halls, and the cross. So we're going to look at that a little bit. Let's see if I can find my place. some pages, so I've got them turned all different ways. All right, this is from BTS. I failed to write down what that stands for, but this is from BTS. I believe it's a periodical, September 1st, 1915. The power that inflicted retributive justice upon man's substituted surety was the power that sustained and upheld the suffering one under the tremendous weight of wrath that would have fallen upon a sinful world. Christ was suffering the death that was pronounced upon the transgressors of God's law. A few years ago, I was thinking and wondering and asking the questions, did Jesus go through the 3 phases of the judgment? And this week, I studied a little bit back then, I don't know, 2-3 years ago, or more maybe even. I'm getting old, the years are going by faster. But this week, I studied this out, and I determined Jesus went through the phases of the judgment that human beings would have to go through if he had not come to be a vicarious substitute for us in the judgment. So this is from Desire of Ages, page 25. Christ was treated as we deserve, that we might be treated as he deserves. He was condemned for our sins, in which he had no share, that we might be justified by his righteousness, in which we had no share. He suffered the death which was ours, that we might receive the life which is his. All right, and this again from Desire of Ages, page 753. Upon Christ as our substitute and surety was laid the iniquity of us all. He was counted a transgressor, that he might redeem us from the condemnation of the law. The guilt of every descendant of Adam was pressing upon his heart. The wrath of God against sin, the terrible manifestation of his displeasure because of iniquity, filled the soul of his Son with consternation. Jesus went through what human beings should go through. What guilty human beings should go through, and what those who don't accept Christ will have to go through. And he necessarily, if he's a vicarious substitute, he would necessarily have to go through everything in every way that human beings would have to go through. He went through all 3 phases of the judgment, and we're going to talk about that a little more. This is from E.J. Wagner. If you've never read L.J. Wagner, just incredible insights. This man had some amazing insights. And this is from E.J. Wagner, Present Truth, September 14th, 1899. Present Truth was a periodical. On the cross, he suffered all the agonies of the lost. He endured everything that men would have been obliged to endure if he had not come, and that the rejectors of him will have to endure at the last. He took all on himself in order to save men. The terrors of the last day, the day of judgment, were present in full on Calvary. And I'm extending that to Gethsemane and the judgment hall for the 3 phases. And as we go through this, we'll discover that in Gethsemane and in the judgment halls and on the cross, there are phrases that we have in the Bible, phrases that really epitomize what that phase of the judgment is all about. So let's look a little bit at, all right, Gethsemane. Gethsemane, Jesus, when he came into the Garden of Gethsemane, was staggering. the disciples had to hold him up and catch him from falling 2 or 3 times, we're told. And he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death." Had he suffered any physical pain yet? Had he been whipped and lashed yet? Had he been nailed to the cross yet? And yet he said he is even unto death. Before any physical pain. And he's staggering. When he got into the garden, he left Peter, James, and John and said, "Now pray with me, watch with me." And he went further and he prayed. And what was the gist of his prayer?
Take this cup from me.
Yes, if it is possible, take this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. That's the phrase that epitomizes this phase of the judgment that we're living in right now. Not my will, but thine. That's what God and Christ are determining right now about your life and mine. Whether or not in your life you've came to the place not where you're just saying, "Not my will, but thine," but living it. He's going to determine whether or not you and I have come to the place through his power where we are living your will and not mine. This is the most important phase of the judgment for us right now, because this is where we are. We're living in this time, this phase of the judgment. Now when Jesus came to the Garden of Gethsemane, he went and he prayed this prayer, and he came back to his disciples and he said, Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Now, how long does it take to say, "Father, let this cup pass from me, but nevertheless your will and not mine"? How long does it take to say that?
5 seconds.
Yeah. Jesus' prayer, those words only summed it up. Those words only summed it up. He was in agony. He was in mental anguish in the garden, and that's what his prayer was all about. In fact, near the end, it says that he sweat great drops of blood. This is a condition called, I believe it's hematidrosis, I think is what it's called. Hematidrosis, and in this condition, people actually do sweat blood, and that is caused by severe anxiety and fear. And people have actually sweat blood when they're in the midst of this kind of heavy anxiety and fear. Jesus went through that. He prayed at least 3 hours, because we know that he came back the first time. "Could you not pray with me 1 hour?" And then again he came back when they were sleeping, and he went again. Jesus was in agony, and he prayed a lot. He prayed earnestly, and he was in agony. He was in agony, but had he suffered any physical trauma yet? This was all mental anguish, mental agony. And if Jesus had to pray that hard in order to come to the place where he's ready to live not my will but yours, if Jesus had to pray like that, what about you and me? Do you think that maybe it's a time for us to be afflicting our souls right now? We need his power in order to live his will and not mine. The only way that we can do it is through his strength and his power. Therefore, we need to spend time in prayer, just as Jesus did, so that we can come to the place where we're ready to give up my will and live his will. That's what this phase of the judgment is all about. Determining whether or not We have spent so much time with Jesus that we're living his will and not ours. All right, so the next thing that Jesus went through was the judgment hall. And in the judgment hall, what phrase or phrases do you think from that story show what this next phase of the judgment is like? Remember, the next phase of the judgment is the Millennial Phase, the post-Advent phase of the judgment. Up in heaven, the righteous are looking through the books. In fact, the Bible says we'll be sitting on thrones. Paul said, don't you know you'll be judging angels? You will judge the world. And in this phase of the judgment, we will be sitting on thrones, judging. What is to be determined in this phase of the judgment? God's decision has to be made in the pre-Advent judgment because your reward has to be there already. Remember, he said, I'm coming again, and my reward is with me to give everyone according to their works. All right? That's determined whether I'm saved or lost by what's happening right now in heaven, the investigative judgment. Because when he comes, there will be a distinction made. Some will rise up to be with him in the air, but what will happen to the wicked at that time? Yes, they'll be destroyed by the brightness of his coming. So that decision is made. So what decision or what's happening during the second phase of the judgment?
He was being accused of blasphemy by saying he was the Son of God. And in answer to it, he said, you say that I am.
Okay. Let's look at it through the story of Jesus' experience in the judgment halls. There are a few phrases that we can take from there. One of them is, Pilate said to the people, I find no fault in him. All right. How does that coincide with the judgment of the 1,000 years? I find no fault in him. Because, yes. I find no fault in him. That's the main focus of the 1,000 years. For every question to be answered. This is from General Conference Bulletin. General Conference Bulletin, 1897. It is now but a little while, and he that shall come will come, and will not tarry. We think of that time as the greatest importance to us because we have a case pending in court. We are now on trial, and soon the judgment will be pronounced to decide our eternal destiny. But there is a good deal more pending in that heavenly court than that. God has a case there. He himself is on trial. And this fact, with which we have to do, is of far greater importance to us than the interests which pertain to ourselves alone. Did you catch that? God himself is on trial. Why is God on trial?
To see if he was just.
Yes. Well, why do we need to see that he's just? Because he's been accused, right? Satan brought an accusation against God. And what would the created universes think if at that moment God went, zap, you're gone.
And he said, right.
I don't have to worry about you anymore. Is that true? If God had went, zap, you're gone, he would have had to worry about that for the rest of eternity. That's why justice is delayed. but not denied. All right, this is from General Prophet's Bulletin again. God's character is now on trial. He who is the accuser of the brethren is above all the accuser of God. He's a liar from the beginning, and in his first lie on earth, he bore false witness against God. Did he bear false witness against God only here on earth? No, it started in heaven, didn't it? Very subtly, very covertly, he accused God of being unjust, unloving, of being harsh and exacting. He accused God of being a liar. He accused God of being selfish. Who does that sound like? That sounds like him, doesn't it? But he accused God. Therefore, God has submitted and will submit to trial. And in heaven, in that second phase of the judgment, that phase of the judgment coincides with the courtroom phase of our criminal justice system, of our justice system. You have a jury of peers who sit and determine whether or not the state is correct in determining that so-and-so is guilty. In this phase of the judgment, we're told we'll sit on thrones, judging the world, and you'll be judging. Don't you know that you'll be judging angels? But also will be determining whether God is just in determining that so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so is guilty. And, well, everyone's guilty. But we're deciding if God is just in bringing judgment upon them. As well as maybe you'll see somebody there sitting beside you on a throne judging, and you'll think, how in the world did he get here? God will answer that question too.
Yeah, it's like Stephen when he was stoned and all the jackets were thrown at Paul's feet, so
Yes.
Stephen's going to be like, what happened here?
Yeah, how'd you get here? All right, so the phrases for this part of what Jesus went through, I find no fault in him. And during that phase of the judgment, we will determine that there is no fault in God in the way he dealt with sin and rebellion throughout the ages. We will find no fault in him. Everything that he has done, we will determine has been on the up and up, has been done through love and justice. That's what that phase of the judgment is all about. I find no fault in him. Behold your king. All right? But there's another phrase in there that explains a little bit about this judgment as well. And remember what they said? We have no king but Caesar. The people who will not be in that phase of the judgment up in heaven, those people will be people who have determined we have no king but Caesar. We don't want this man to rule over us. So that's another part of this experience that Jesus went through that coincides with the judgment. All right. So the next phase of what Jesus went through, of course, was the cross. And was the cross right outside the judgment hall? No. It was not, was it? There was a walk, a stumbling for him, really, to get to Golgotha, the hill where he was crucified. All right, so last week, it was 2 weeks ago, we talked about the cross. And if you remember, we determined that it was not the cross itself and the physical pain that he was going through that killed him. If you remember, we had some quotations that said that Jesus didn't really even feel the physical pain because of what?
Mental anguish.
The mental anguish that he was going through. The crushing weight of of the sins of the world, the separation that happened between him and his Father. That's what killed him. That's what brought him to death. Remember when they came to get the body from Pilate, and they said he was already dead, Pilate wondered about that. Well, how could he be already dead? Because crucifixion was a long death. And he even brought his centurion in and said, "Is he really dead already? And go check for me." So when they went to break his legs, he was dead, and they pierced his side. So what Jesus experienced, what brought him to death, was the mental anguish, the weight, the crushing weight of the sins of the world. Now, was there physical pain? There was. Was there physical trauma? He was nailed to a cross. They whipped him so that he was unrecognizable. And through all of that, there are people who suffer what they call bipolar depression. These people often want to commit suicide. And these people will tell you that the mental anguish that they're going through is worse than any physical pain that you can go through. Jesus suffered that way. Now, in the judgment, after the millennium, we're told in Revelation chapter 20 that the rest of the dead were not resurrected until after the 1,000 years. Who's the rest of the dead? The wicked, the unsaved. They will be resurrected after the 1,000 years. And then what does Satan do at that time? Yeah, he says, "Hey, look everybody, I've raised you from the dead. I am the glorious power of God. I raised you from the dead, but look in that city, that little company in there. They're trying to say that God's there. We can take them. We can take them. Hitler's there. Probably Patton's there. Maybe. Stalin. Yeah. And these generals who were really good. Maybe Alexander the Great is there. One of the greatest military leaders that ever lived. And these people, Satan will talk to them. He's actually going to have a conference with these people. Let's take the city. They refurbish weapons of war. They refurbish tanks and all that stuff. And they try to go against God. They surround the city. And what happens is God comes up. He rises up from the city, and it's called a great white throne judgment. And as he rises up, his very presence, his glory spreads out everywhere. And while that's happening, the cross is lifted up, and in panoramic view, all the wicked host who have surrounded the city, every one of them will see the passion of Christ. And they will see everything that God has tried to do to save them. God left nothing undone to try and save them. And they will see in all that God has done that he is just. And every one of them, will bow down and worship God and say, "You are just, oh God." Yes. And every one of them will accept their fate because they'll see and know without a shadow of a doubt that what they're about to receive is just from God's hand. God will then, and only then, administer the execution of the judgment. Now remember, when Jesus suffered the execution of the judgment, he suffered severe mental anguish. And the crushing weight of sin is what killed him. And the separation, his separation from the Father. Right? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? That epitomizes this phase of the judgment. And on the cross, there were several phrases that coincide with this phase of the judgment. He said, it is finished, right? And this is the last phase of the judgment. This is the end of sin. It is finished. When this happens, it's finished. And once everyone in that vast multitude bowed down, including Satan himself, once every one of them bowed down and acknowledged, God, everything you've done is just. Everything you've done is done out of love. And I did not accept it. I spurned it. Every one of them, only once they acknowledge that, the wicked hosts, then the sentence can be carried out. Now, again, Jesus suffered mental anguish and the crushing weight of sin and the separation from his Father. That's what killed him. But remember, there was also a physical aspect to the trauma that he went through, though he didn't feel that as much as the anguish. It's the same in the judgment. The very fire of God, which is his visible, palpable character and his glory, that is what to the righteous is life. But to the wicked hosts, it's their death. In that anguish, but there's also a physical aspect to this as well, because that same fire that destroys the wicked also cleanses the earth and makes it new. So there's both aspects in the judgment. And God is just in carrying out this judgment. So I want to close with, just a few quotations. This is from Great Controversy 670. Satan sees that his voluntary rebellion has unfitted him for heaven. He has trained his powers to war against God. The purity, peace, and harmony of heaven would be to him supreme torture. His accusations against the mercy and justice of God are now silenced. The reproach which he has endeavored to cast upon Jehovah rests wholly upon himself. And now Satan bows down and confesses the justice of his sentence. All right, again, the next paragraph. Who shall not fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name? For thou only art holy. For all nations shall come and worship before thee, for thy judgments are made manifest. Every question of truth and error in the long-standing controversy has now been made plain. The results of rebellion, the fruits of setting aside the divine statutes, have been laid open to the view of all created intelligences. The working out of Satan's rule in contrast with the government of God has presented to the whole universe. Satan's own works have condemned him. God's wisdom, his justice, and his goodness stand fully vindicated. It is seen that all his dealings with the great controversy have been conducted with respect to the eternal good of his people and the good of all the worlds that he has created. The history of sin will stand to all eternity as a witness that with the existence of God's law is bound up the happiness of all the beings he has created. With all the facts in the great controversy in view, the whole universe, both loyal and rebellious, with one accord declared, just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. And all are satisfied, and only then will the sentence be carried out. And this is the only way that it really could have been done, and yet preserved our freedom of choice, our freedom of will, and also his very character. Justice has been delayed a long time for us, but it will be meted out. And again, the most important
Heavenly Father, Lord, I want to invite you into every part of our lives. Lord, I want to ask you to create in us your will. Lord, I just pray that you will create in us a clean heart and bring us to the place where we are ready to not just say, Lord, let your will be done, but actually live it, Lord. Live your will in our lives. Starting now, let us be changed from this moment. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.